So, do we actually overestimate the effects of new technology on war? And here I think there need to be one or two notes of caution in terms of what the proponents of new weapon systems argue. Let's just think for a moment. You develop a new technology of application to war, whether it is the invention of a rifled, breech-loading rifled firearm, or whether it is the arrival of the drone, and you say, this will transform our understanding of war. This is a game changer. And of course, having developed this, I'm assuming notionally we have an individual who is proposing this. Having developed this, you then make the case for saying, this will transform every aspect of war. It'll mean whoever has it is on the winning side. Whoever doesn't have it will lose. You won't knowingly undersell your own invention. And a bandwagon then develops behind this to support the argument, particularly, of course, the ability of arms manufacturers to mobilize those who are going to use this weapon, that is the armed forces of the country in which they live, and of course the possibility of that country selling this weapon to other countries, that this will give them a relative advantage which can be defined as in some respects definitive. Now the reason that this is exaggerated seems to me, there's several reasons. The first is that when you put a complex system onto the battlefield, it then has to cope with all those phenomena I've already described in relation to Clausewitz. In other words, it pours with rain. The fog comes down. The guy who's operating it hasn't been properly trained on its application. Something breaks within the system, a particularly significant part which you can't get hold of. When I was in Ukraine in April, I asked about UK Challenger tanks, and they said it's wonderful having your 14 Challenger tanks. It would be very helpful if we had some spare parts as well. The trouble is that the UK hasn't got any spare parts. The second problem is that, of course, when you introduce a new weapon into any of the armed forces, they already have a lot of weapons, some of them so-called legacy systems, the products of older designs. They can't simply put it on the shelf. They have to be made compatible with the new systems. So the two have to work alongside each other. And that requires compromise between the two systems. And even if it doesn't require compromise, the way in which you use the new system has to be compatible with the old system. So essentially, no armed forces, including even the United States', go to war with the weapons of 2023. The British aircraft carriers, which are finally now being used, deployed the Prince of Wales, seems finally to be able to go in one direction, a reasonably consistent pattern after several hiccups. The new aircraft carriers were commissioned by the government originally in 1998. We're already 25 years on, and they've got a 50-year lifespan. We've got to find a job for them. Thirdly, there is a tendency always to maximize the virtues of new offensive capabilities. To say this will be the game changer. What of course also matters in this balance, when you're conducting war, is the capabilities of the defense. And the tendency, once a new weapon system has evolved, is to find a counter to it. There is nowhere more competitive than the battle space. And the response can really be quite fast. Sometimes, of course, it takes technological development. But when the Dreadnought battleship was launched at the beginning of the 20th century, then, of course, there was a response in the form of the submarine, a response in terms of the torpedo. When the tank arrived on the battlefield in 1915-16, the response was the anti-tank weapon, the anti-tank gun. The bomber would always get through in the 1930s. Fighters actually provided a pretty effective defense, and anti-aircraft fire, but the fighter especially. And right now, today, we're seeing just how effective air defense systems can be over a country that hasn't got a large air force, that is Ukraine, and therefore providing a degree of resilience which was not anticipated by those who talked about the effectiveness of some weapon systems. Much more significantly, and even more often written out of the narrative, is the notion that the enemy can actually have this technology. One of the extraordinary features, it seemed to me, about the adoption of drones, which I'm going to say a few more words about in a minute, about the adoption of drones by the United States, was the sort of presumption that nobody else would use them in the way in which the United States would want to use them, that it would somehow be a unique capability. When it was already self-evident, first of all, that drone technology was remarkably simple, remarkably capable of multiple applications. And when roughly 70 states a decade ago already had drones and were using them, not necessarily in offensive and military terms, but had the facility to be able to do them. In other words, the effects of the introduction by one country of what seems to be a game changer can be immediately neutralized by the response. And of course, the enemy also has the option to fight in other ways. So you don't have, in 18th century terms, to stand on the battlefield and be shot at. What you can actually do is avoid the battlefield entirely, and people have been doing that for a very long time in terms of guerrilla warfare and the way in which guerrillas would fight. Terrorism is another response. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Americans called this asymmetric war, an extraordinary assumption, because war, almost by definition, is always asymmetric. The enemy will try to do something other than you want him to do or her to do, and the response, therefore, goes in directions that you cannot fully anticipate. So for all those reasons, I think we do tend to overestimate, or we don't. You're all wiser than that, and I'm wiser than that. But those who are advocating that your armed force, Norway's armed forces should have some new weapon systems are not knowingly going to undersell them.